Welcome back. My name is Sam Hassel, and in today's episode, we are going to be revisiting the Applying to College forum on Reddit. So this is a very popular online forum to ask college-related questions. There are over 1.1 million members in this forum, and so this will be a reprisal of one of our earlier episodes. I believe it was episode 11, and so we're going to take 5 different questions from this popular college admissions forum. We're going to be giving our opinion and our take, and we'll also entertain some of the other comments and what some other answers and replies are to these questions as well, and some of their potential shortcomings. So we're going to get into that shortly. I do want to mention to anyone more broadly, if you have an admissions-related question that you would like to ask and for us to potentially cover on the podcast at some point in the future, we're going to be including a link in the show notes, the show summary, and you can send us an email with that question, and we'll possibly spotlight it on the podcast and give a detailed response in the future. So let's get into it. First question here that we have in the forum. The subject is long additional information section. So the student's referring to the additional information section of the common application, which is a 650-word maximum addendum that you can submit with the common application. They put long additional information section, good or bad, ? And the text here reads, is it bad to use the additional information section to list extra awards, activities, and to contextualize the research conferences where I presented that I couldn't fit in the main section of my common application? I read this post where a top 10 admissions officer says it causes eye rolls to have long additional information sections, but I feel that is an important part of my application. So couple of clarifications here. One is the student is not asking a question as to whether additional information section is good or bad in any case, but particularly a long additional information section. So it sounds like they have a very lengthy additional information section. Either way, I would say that one of the important factors here is going to be, I like to use a lot of sort of ratios for making decisions in the college admissions process. And the ratio that I would employ here, particularly for components like the additional information section, is space to value to space, essentially, or space to value. So that basically means that how valuable is this information in terms of what it conveys about the students? Is this very relevant information in terms of what the student's admissions hook is, what their main academic focus, what their main academic narrative is that they're going to be selling the college on? So we've discussed that a lot in our earlier episodes. So if, this student has science research and they can't contextualize it enough in just the activities list because that's a very short section, they give you very short descriptions for the activities in the common application. If you feel like there's a lot of additional value, contributions, publication you want to discuss, etc., it could be conferences. There's just such limited space to cover that in the main activities list that particularly also if it's going to be relevant to your admissions hook, if you have science research and you're positioning for something where science research is going to be particularly relevant to that narrative, if you are positioning for something like business and you've run a business and you want to give a lot more context about it than the activities list really affords you, then that is particularly valuable information, and you don't want to be submitting an application and just losing out on all those, valuable and potentially relevant contributions. You do want to keep the additional information section as short as you possibly can, and if this is going to have lower value information, then it does not merit taking up further space. So again, you really want to consider what is this basically diluting down the, are you just adding more words, which is making the application longer to read and more frustrating for an admissions officer, and you're not necessarily giving them any new, particularly relevant, compelling information. That would be a very bad situation. However, if you have very valuable information to convey, particularly that's going to be relevant to your admissions hook, and it can't go anywhere else in the application, then that is a more acceptable use for additional information section. Unacceptable uses are going to be things like adding an additional essay in the additional information section, a lot of excuse making as to why you got some lower grades. Really, that should go in a counselor letter of recommendation. It's not best coming from a student's mouth. It's much better coming from a more neutral, objective person's mouth. So I don't like things like trying to add an extra essay. We've seen a student who came to us very late last year after they submitted their Stanford application, and they were putting things like what books they like to read. That is going to drive an admissions officer crazy. And when the student is talking about this post, from a top 10 admissions officer, and they said that the additional information section causes eye rolls when students have these long additional information section, that's assuming a very particular type of additional information section. First off, again, they're focusing on a very long additional information section. Many students have fluff in those long additional information sections. And so this is where you really have to contextualize what an admissions officer is saying and provide a lot more nuance, because a lot of times they don't. So this is sort of something like if I ask somebody, so I'm here in New York City, if I were to ask somebody who lives in New York City, would you like to have a stranger come up to you on the street? They would probably say no, because in their head, they're imagining a very particular type of stranger, one that is common in New York City, probably somebody who's soliciting them, trying to sell them something, trying to bother them, and they don't want to be inconvenienced. So their answer would be generally no, but that's because they've already assumed a particular type of situation. It's the same thing with admissions officers. A lot of times admissions officers assume a particular type of situation when they're asked a question and they come up with a response. So yes, if we're talking about long additional information sections, and a whole bunch of the additional information sections that many students submit, which are very fluffy, irrelevant, they're not adding much more value, and there's adding more fluff information to the application that is going to frustrate an admissions officer. However, if this is novel information that hasn't been conveyed elsewhere, they don't like redundancy. This is why students are often provided the opportunity to upload a resume. In a lot of the school supplements, we strongly discourage uploading a resume, because a lot of times it will simply repeat information from the activities list, and it can be shortened in a lot of cases in the activities list. And then you still have the additional information section for any overflow. So a resume is, again, you're really increasing the amount of information they have to read in the application. You should just try to do your best to stick to those main containers, the additional information section included. But we really don't want to have them get frustrated by having to read even more information. That can be frustrating to an admissions officer. But at the same time, we don't want to omit highly compelling information from the application, because an admissions officer cannot evaluate you fully and will not evaluate you in an optimal manner, the manner that you really want, if you've left out extremely compelling information about yourself. So that is not a good trade-off, to take an admissions officer statement of, we don't like additional information sections, and you have potentially a lot of really high-value information. You ran a very successful organization, a successful business. You just don't have the space to really discuss that. The essays are not really an appropriate vehicle for that. You can discuss your passion for business, but it's not a place to give a technical exposition of a business, the metrics. Additional information section, activities list, these are more objective tones. Whereas in the essays, it's more of a subjective sort of a narrative. It's not for technical exposition of science research or conferences, not the writing style that's appropriate for the essays. So it can very well be the case that a student does have a lot of high-value, significant, relevant achievements, and they do need to be conveyed and included in the additional information section. And again, that will be for things such as running an organization. If you have a lot of relevant activities to your hook and they simply cannot make the activities list, or you have honors and they can't fit in the 5 honors that you're afforded, but they are very relevant, they're high value, again, you have to take into account the value of that information, and value is going to derive, of course, from factors that we discussed for activities and building a resume in general in our 10 Ways to Build an Admissions Hook episode. Value is derived from factors such as relevance to the admissions hook, things like depth, things like scarcity or uniqueness. So if you have a major honor, and for some reason you just couldn't fit it into the 5 in the honor section of the main common application, but it's a very deeply involved, very relevant, very impressive, scarce distinction, to omit that from your application would be very unwise. Also, because it's an honor, it doesn't take up very much space, right? So this is where I'm talking about sort of monitoring this value to space sort of trade-off here, is if it conveys a lot of value in a very compact way, that's really optimal. If you have something that conveys not a lot of value and it's going to take you 200 words to talk about, that's really bad. So you talking about what books you like to read or some really random, totally irrelevant to your admissions hook hobby that you have in the additional information section and taking up 300 words, that will drive an admissions officer crazy. So I do want to contextualize that a lot more, because admissions officers say something, but they haven't really provided the requisite amount of nuance. And because a lot of students and families have such a great propensity, I see this very often, they want black and white answers, right? They want just, this is the way that it is. Every admissions officer and every school thinks this way, and that's the way that it is. And unfortunately, it's not black and white. You're dealing with a lot of gray and subjectivity and a lot of different contextual parameters and nuances. So hopefully that sort of sheds some light on why an admissions officer might be saying that. They're assuming they've come up across a lot of bad experiences. And generally speaking, we know psychologically bad experiences stick out more than positive experiences. So there might be some students who've really executed this additional context was very helpful to the admissions officer, but because they also have many students who pull this off and execute on this the wrong way, it's just going to tend to be more frequent that students don't execute on this appropriately, and those experiences tend to stick out because they increase, again, the admissions officer's frustration and stress and just amount of annoyance having to decide through all of these different applications. So hopefully that should answer this question. One person in the comments here put, keep in mind that if colleges wanted long, excruciatingly detailed write-ups to quote-unquote contextualize applicants' activities, they would tell the common application to provide more room in the activity section. Okay, so I don't love this comment. First of all, you have to understand, and I pointed this out in the biggest college essay mistake episode that we had, in which I discussed why the personal essay in the common application is really a misnomer for students who are targeting the most selective institutions in particular. And in that episode, I really focused on the fact that the common application is meant to serve many, many different institutions with very wide-ranging degrees of selectivity. So even once you get to a college that's maybe number 85, in the United States, you're starting to get into 70%, 80% acceptance rates. You take a school like Arizona State, roughly around, a top 100, top 125 college in the United States, it has a 90% acceptance rate. So you can't say that if these colleges, which colleges are you talking about? The common application serves over 1,000 colleges in the United States. And once you've even gotten to number 100, you're talking about schools that take almost all of the applicants. So we really have to keep in mind that the students who tend to be targeting the most selective institutions and the institutions that we really focus on in this podcast, those students are, on average, going to be much more accomplished, have a lot more activities, relevant to their admissions hook. They might have run a substantial organization, have a business, etc. And so for that student who might be in a small niche of the overall applicant pool, all the students who are using the common application, targeting a very, very small fraction of the overall colleges that the common application serves, because it doesn't just serve the top 25 most selective institutions in the United States, it serves 40 times that, and even greater than that. You can't just make a general statement and say, oh, well, if the colleges really wanted, this extra information, well, the students who are targeting a top 5 college are very different from the students who are targeting, a college that's number, 995 in the United States. So I would keep that in mind for students who are targeting highly selective institutions and are going to be competitive applicants. Those students do tend to have a lot of accomplishments. They have a lot of activities. They have a lot of overflow. They also have a lot of contributions that cannot fairly be captured by the very minimal space that's afforded students in the activities list. So if you were talking about a student who is appropriately aiming for, a top 100 institution, the activities list probably provides them way more space than they honestly even need. With having 10 activities, the honor section provides them with way more space. It gives you 5 honors. It might provide them way more space than they even need to take up. However, there are some students, and they just really have a lot of overflow. They have massive contributions, many different activities. And so you can't generalize, and you can't give the same advice to those two very different student cases, and different as well in terms of the institutions that they're targeting. So I disagree a bit with that perspective. Also, you can make the argument that a lot of these colleges have resume uploads. Again, I don't believe students should utilize that. I think the additional information section is more than enough to add any further context or overflow activities from the additional information section, or overflow bullet points or contributions, which I generally don't suggest unless it's a very substantial, business or an organization. Don't just go add some bullets and say, oh, for number activity, activity 7 from the activities list, here are some additional bullets. Don't do that. But you can discuss, something that's very substantial, like an organization that you potentially run, a business, potentially science research. But these colleges do allow for resume upload. So certainly a lot of these colleges are at least aware, even if you shouldn't take advantage of this opportunity per se, they're at least aware that students might have overflow, achievements and contributions and activities. I will also say, again, if you are putting lower value information here, it's not a good idea. We had a student in the last episode where he had some, school honor rolls. So we sort of filled up his honor section in the main part of the common application. And, he might have had a number 6, a number 7, a number 8 award if you started including some of his school honor rolls. But those are very low value distinctions. They're what I've referred to as epiphenomenal awards. That means that they don't really convey any new information. I could see what a student's grades are from their transcript. And so it doesn't really convey any new information. Tons of students are on honor rolls. And so I would not, even though he had that, some of those, quote unquote honors, I didn't say to put it in the additional information section because the value just it just wasn't impressive enough to really merit, taking up additional space and adding to the admissions officer's review time and potential frustration. So I did not have him put that in there. However, he had, because his resume was quite lacking in terms of formal extracurriculars, he did have some very nice informal activities, sort of hobbies with model rocketry. He had some investment, running a portfolio, and that did show good intellectual vitality. And particularly because he was lacking in a lot more of the formal activities that would go in the activities list, we were going to put that in additional information section because he really needed to make use and show the colleges some of that extra intellectual vitality that was very strong in his case. So that could be the case as well. You could have a student where, we had a student a couple of years ago where they were positioning for history, and they happened to have this informal, shipwreck diving. They were diving for, just historical, shipwrecks, and that was very relevant to the hook. It was more of an informal hobby, so it wasn't really appropriate to go on the activities list, but it was very relevant. It was very cool, very unique, very niche, and that was acceptable to go in the additional information section. The student also had a little bit more of a lacking resume and activities list because they started the process so late. So it was also, again, particularly in the context of that student, similar to the one that I covered in the last episode, it was that value was quite substantial relative to their activities list, that hobby, whereas for another student who had 10 amazing formal extracurriculars in the activities list, adding an additional relevant hobby would be lower relative value in that student's case. So it is very, very contextual. I know a lot of people are looking for black and white answers, but it is very contextual to the student's case. Whether activities do they have? Is this information relevant or not? What other things do you have? They're taking up space in the additional information section. So there's just a lot of nuance here. And this is why I always caution people from just taking an admissions officer's statement or, somebody just, saying, oh, well, if the colleges really wanted that, then they would have, then they would tell the Common App to provide more room in the activities section for longer descriptions. Well, what colleges are you talking about? Because there's 1,000 different colleges that use the Common Application. So we do have to keep all of those nuances in mind. Okay, second question here. So the title is Optional Recommender. And it says, if a school allows for greater than 2 teacher recommendations, and I already put in core subject teachers, should I put the other non-core subject teacher I want to add in the main recommender section because they're still a teacher at my school, or should I put them in the other recommender section? So what the student's referring to here is if you go into the common application and you add the colleges, to your school list in the common application, and you look at the My Colleges, there'll be sort of an information page or, just kind of a general, instructions and sort of a profile with the school's deadlines, the number of recommendations they allow. And some schools do allow more than 2 teacher recommendations. So it is generally the case that a lot of the top and highly selective schools they certainly require at least 1 teacher recommendation almost invariably. There are some schools such as USC, the University of Southern California. They have such a large applicant pool. They don't have any recommendations that are actually allowed. The UC is very similar. They don't have any recommendations. That would only be in a later stage of the review process, sort of ad hoc. They might request a recommendation. But the vast majority of highly selective schools do require at least 1, if not 2 teacher recommendations. And you can look at that sort of profile page or that college page in the common application, and it will tell you how many recommendations. So what the requirements are for a guidance counselor recommendation, what their policies are with respect to teacher recommendations, and then what their policy is with respect to supplementary recommendations, or the way that the Common App refers to it, other recommenders. So this student wants to potentially submit a 3rd teacher recommendation. And so this will be a moot point at colleges where that's not allowed, if they don't allow more than, so that it will say how many are required. And then it might say, 2 are required in terms of teacher recommendations. But then, some schools like Cornell allow a lot of recommendations. So they might say, you have 2 that are required, and then you could submit up to another 3, which is pretty crazy. So just because a college allows for that does not mean you should necessarily take advantage of it or use that additional opportunity. And we're sort of running up against a lot of the same factors that we were considering in the last question, which is sort of this consideration of value relative to space, right? Or how much space is this adding? How much time is this adding to the application review? How many more words is this adding? Because that in and of itself sort of is always a cost, right? Anytime you're thickening the file, there's a phrase in admissions, the thicker the file, the thicker the applicant. Anytime you're thickening the file, so the file is growing longer in terms of time or space, but the value is not necessarily increasing, that is really bad, right? So if I'm not getting any new information, I'm not getting any new or additional value or further reinforcement of the hook or the themes or relevance or indication as to what very particular niche role do you serve in the incoming freshman class that would make me want to accept you, space is always a cost. Think about it in terms of like if you were buying real estate. An acre of land has a cost to it. So there's always a baked in cost. You have to justify from a value perspective why you would want to increase that amount of application real estate, why you would add an extra minute to an 8-minute application review. Because proportionally, a minute might not seem like a lot in a vacuum, but a minute when you're going from 8 minutes to 9 minutes of application review is actually reasonably substantial. So you should not necessarily take advantage of this opportunity that a college provides to just go submit a ton of letters of recommendation. So I do want to sort of make that clear. I have never seen a college that requires 3 teacher recommendations. So past 2, you are generally safe in terms of meeting a college's requirements, any college. 3 teacher recommendations, I would strongly encourage students not to submit 3 teacher recommendations. Everything that needs to be contained and conveyed about a student should be capable of being transmitted via 2 teacher recommendations. And again, keep in mind there are other recommendations. So there's a counselor letter of recommendation. So now you're at 3 recommendations, especially for a lot of the top schools, they require a counselor letter of recommendation. And then you might also have an other recommender or supplementary recommendation. And so with just 2 teachers, you might end up having 4 recommendations because you have a counselor writing letter of recommendation and you potentially have a supplementary letter of recommendation. So keep in mind, it's not just the teachers per se. So this student is considering adding a third teacher, I would generally strongly discourage that. But let's sort of indulge this a little bit in a bit of this topic, because they're asking, if I had a third teacher, where would they go? Would they go in the teacher recommendations? Would I invite them in the common application via the teacher recommender section? And would I include them that way? Or would I go to the other recommender section and include them as basically a supplementary recommender? So there is a comment here, and the student is sort of drawing a false distinction, not an appropriate distinction here. They're trying to basically bifurcate between the teacher being in a core subject. So the core academic subjects are going to be history, English, math, science, and foreign language. Those are the 5 traditionally understood core subjects, versus them teaching a non-core class. So that could be something like science research. That could be something like, an engineering elective, an entrepreneurship elective, a business elective, something that's not really, a meat and potatoes core curriculum class. That's the distinction that they're drawing in terms of figuring out whether this goes in the teacher recommendation section or the other recommendation section. And then somebody comes in the comments and says, if they're not one of your core subject teachers, then it's better to add them as an other recommender or as a supplementary recommender instead of a teacher recommender. And that's actually false. This person actually happens to be the moderator of this Applying to College forum, so apparently the moderators need to be moderated as well. But that's not true. So the distinction between what counts or what constitutes a teacher recommendation versus an other recommender or supplementary recommendation is the distinction between, is this person contextualizing your performance or you as an applicant in the context of an academic subject in a classroom environment or classroom setting, versus is this recommender contextualizing you outside of the classroom in a how you performed in a subject per se. So the distinction is not necessarily even whether this person is a teacher. It's not anything to do with whether they teach you in a core subject or a non-core subject. It's basically inside the classroom or outside the classroom. Inside the classroom is a teacher recommendation. Outside the classroom is a supplementary recommendation. Now, it can be the case that somebody is a teacher at the high school. They might have even taught you in a subject, in a core subject, but you're still using them to contextualize you outside of the classroom. So in which case they would be a supplementary recommender, even though they are a teacher. They even taught you by this sort of false dichotomy that the students and the moderator here are calling attention to. They even taught you in a core subject, but they're still a supplementary recommender because they're speaking to your outside the classroom performance. So I'll give an example. We had a student a couple of years ago. She's currently a sophomore at Duke, and she had 2 teacher recommenders, and then she had another person who taught her at her high school. They taught her in a core subject freshman year, 9th grade English. However, this person was also her club advisor, and that club she had started very early on in high school. It was a very deep involvement. It was very connected to her admissions hook. It had thrown off some additional honors that went in her honor section. It was the first chapter in New York State at a high school. So it was a very important club, an important activity. And this person, of course, and if you're going to include a supplementary recommendation, again, you have to keep in mind you're adding more space or more review time to the application. You don't want to do so without signaling new or highly, highly compelling information. So this person thought the world of this student, right? And this is where you really look for these exceptional superlatives, particularly if you are adding optional information and an optional recommendation here. It has to really be exceptional because you already, again, she had 2 teacher recommendations already in the application. She had a counselor recommendation. So this is a 4th letter of recommendation. It's a lot of recommendations to go through. It better be excellent or really convey new information. So this teacher thought the world of her. He said, this is the best student that I've come across out of X number of students in my 20 years, of teaching and, being parts of different clubs and the extracurricular environment at the school. And so it was an exceptional letter. This person absolutely loved her. And he had overseen her in a non-academic context as well, particularly being the club advisor with her for this very important, very relevant club to her admissions hook for multiple years. Okay, so that was not a teacher recommendation. We did not submit that via the teacher recommendation section. That was not a third teacher recommendation. That was an other recommender or supplementary recommendation because the primary purpose of his letter was contextualizing the student outside of the classroom in that extracurricular and in that club, that very critical resume piece that was very relevant to her admissions narrative. And very specifically, we told that teacher, please focus this letter in large parts on that outside the classroom experience with the students, not so much the inside the classroom experience. Now, could he have spoken a tiny bit in passing about the inside the classroom? Sure, but that wasn't the main purpose of the letter. And so for it to be congruent with the supplementary recommendation, we also wanted him to be speaking more to the outside the classroom. She already had more than enough firepower in terms of her recommendations from the other two teachers who were already very adequately covering her from a more inside the classroom perspective. So to answer the student's question, I would strongly discourage having a third teacher recommendation, particularly again from, it sounds like this student is aiming for a teacher who does not teach a core subject. Even more so, I would discourage that if they already have two teachers already writing letters, from a core subject perspective. You're just adding more information. It's probably going to be highly redundant with the other letters. And even if they did want to add another letter, it would go, if this were outside the classroom, it would go in the supplementary or the other recommendation section if that was what they were contextualizing as outside the classroom. In this case, it sounds like the student is talking about a third teacher recommendation because they are contextualizing the student's inside the classroom performance. It just happens to be in a non-core subject. And in that case, it would be a third teacher recommendation, but I would strongly discourage the student from submitting a third teacher recommendation. Okay, for the third question here. Counselor says I can't apply early action if I apply early decision is the title of this post. And so the text here reads, my counselor told me recently that if I apply early decision, I can't apply to early action schools, as my early action schools will know I applied early decision for Northwestern and will ignore my application until I get rejected, which will be in December. But all my early action schools deadlines are November 1st, which means I can't apply to my early action schools. Is she correct about this? I've been researching and it says I can apply early action even if I apply early decision. It's just that I have to withdraw my decisions if I get accepted. And so a whole bunch of people in the comments utterly blasted this counselor because this is incorrect. And so she added a brief PS here. They put edit, she's my high school counselor. I asked her to write me a letter of recommendation as it's required. So basically they were saying, a lot of people were saying you should get rid of your counselor. And the student was basically updating the post to say, I can't get rid of her. She's my high school counselor. And she's also writing me a letter of recommendation. So I can't tell her she's clearly wrong about this because I don't want to potentially rub her the wrong way as she's writing a letter of recommendation for me to colleges. So, slightly scary that this is a high school counselor giving patently false information. But so if you're applying early decision, and to remind the audience, a lot of you already know this, but early decision is a binding commitment. And so there tend to typically be 2 rounds of early decision. Some colleges only have 1 round of early decision. Some schools don't have any round of early decision whatsoever. But for what's referred to as ED1, that deadline is typically going to be November 1st. And you submit your application by November 1st. You typically hear back in December. And if they accept you, it's a binding commitment. You have to attend the school if they take you. The second round of early decision tends to be closer to the regular decision application deadlines. And so it's typically around January. It could be January 1st. It could be January 2nd, January 5th, January 7th, depends on the school. And that's a second round of early decision. That's also a binding commitment. Those decisions come back typically around, early to mid-February. And again, if you're accepted in that early decision 2 round, you are obligated to attend. So early decision is a binding commitment. Early action just means you're putting in an early application, typically again by November 1st or sometime there around. However, it's not binding if you apply early action. So early decision is you are making a decision and submitting a binding commitment that you will go to that school. Early action is not binding, but you're typically putting your application in earlier. You're not getting the massive odds boost that early decision provides you. Of course, a college is going to prioritize its ED applicants because those are the most committed applicants to attend the college. And so they know that if they accept you, you definitely are coming to the college. And because college's yield rate is very important to them, that's the percentage of students from those accepted that choose to actually enroll at the college, because that number is very important and that commitment is very important to a lot of colleges. You get a much bigger odds boost in terms of your chances of admission for early decision, the binding commitment, versus early action. So early action might provide a small bit of odds boost, but you're not really signaling to the college that this is your top school. And so it's more of a marginal odds boost, and you're submitting early, but it's non-binding. So if you are applying for early decision 1 around the November 1st deadline, there are only 7 schools in the United States to which you cannot also apply early. Their plans block out applying early decision to any other institution. So those 7 colleges, 5 of them are have what I refer to as a single choice early action plan, which is the most restrictive plan in terms of early action plans. And I covered this in one of our earlier episodes where I sort of bifurcated between single choice early action and restrictive early action, because a lot of the colleges use the terms interchangeably. A lot of people use the terms interchangeably, but there is a meaningful difference between single choice early action and restrictive early action. And I did reference that some of those distinctions in one of our earlier episodes. So the 5 single choice early action schools, in the way that I defined in that earlier episode, are 3 of the top Ivies, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, that are on the East Coast. You have 2 on the West Coast in California, Stanford and Caltech. So those 5 schools practice what's known, at least what we refer to as single choice early action, which blocks out nearly every other private institution for early action or early decision. There are a couple of exceptions that I'm not going to go into, such as it depends on when that private school's early action decision gets returned. Yale has updated the policy. And then, some of these schools also have policies such as, if you would have to apply early action to that private school to meet a merit scholarship deadline, it gets exempted. And so, for example, students applying single choice early action to Stanford, that will block out doing early action, early decision to just about any other private institution in the United States. However, you can actually apply to USC, a school such as USC, because USC requires that if you want to get a merit scholarship, you have to apply by the early action deadline. So that's a special exemption or exception to Stanford's single choice early action policy. But generally, those 5 single choice early action schools, again, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, and Caltech, generally do block out just about every other private, not public, but private institution for either early action or early decision. So there are those 5, what we refer to as single choice early action schools. That's the most restrictive early action plan. Then there are 2, highly regarded top 20 Catholic universities in Notre Dame and Georgetown. And those 2 schools have a policy that we refer to as restrictive early action, and that blocks out early decision to any school. So for those 7 schools that I just mentioned that have a single choice early action or restrictive early action plan, not just regular early action, for those 7 schools, you cannot apply ED1. So those are, if you're applying early decision, you cannot apply to any of those 7 schools if you're doing early decision 1 by November 1st. And again, those schools are Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, Caltech, Georgetown, and Notre Dame. So those are just 7 schools in the United States you cannot apply to at the same time under their single choice or restrictive early action plans if you're doing early decision 1 by November 1st. That's it. If another school has early action, such as Michigan, where it's not a restrictive policy, you could apply to Michigan early action if you're doing ED Northwestern. You could apply to Tulane early action. You could apply to Richmond. You could apply to the University of Chicago early action. You could apply to the University of Virginia under their early action policy. And it wouldn't be blocked out if the student is doing ED1 to Northwestern. So it's just those 7 schools. And then, of course, you cannot apply to multiple schools in the same ED round under an early decision plan. That should hopefully be quite clear to people that you cannot apply to multiple schools for early decision. So, of course, they cannot do ED1 to Northwestern and then do ED1 to Chicago, for example. But I think that's already clear. In terms of their main question, in terms of what ED1 blocks out in terms of early action schools, it's only the single choice and restrictive early action schools, those 7 colleges that I named, that would be precluded by applying ED1 to Northwestern by November 1st. Okay, for number 4, question number 4 here, help with the Vanderbilt supplemental, please. with a bunch of exclamation points is the subject line. Hey guys, I'm working on the Vanderbilt supplemental right now and I'm struggling quite a bit. The prompt is Vanderbilt University's motto is Latin for dare to grow. In your response, reflect on how one or more aspects of your identity, culture, or background has played a role in your personal growth and how it will contribute to our campus community as you dare to grow at Vanderbilt. I'm struggling the most because I really just don't have much of a culture or anything. I'm a blonde, middle-class white girl who does cheerleading. Appreciate the self-awareness. All I can really think of is my ADHD diagnosis freshman year. So do you guys think that could work as a topic? Also, if anyone has any ideas, I would so appreciate it. Thank you in advance. And there is a comment here, the top-rated comment, neurodivergence is definitely a part of diversity. You could talk about the unique traits you bring to the table, and if you've been involved in disability/neurodiversity club, you could talk about that too. Also, have you or a loved one faced any challenges that have shaped you? It can be as common as your parents divorcing, a family member's health challenge, or something you've learned through helping a friend who has struggling. I'm pretty sure if you've struggling, that would mean that you're not actually struggling, but we'll leave the semantics aside. So yeah, I would actually say that a whole bunch of those recommended topics are quite poor topics for a college essay. But what the person is trying to do and what the trap is that the student's falling into, and I discussed this on the last episode, is they're trying to be the, perfect student from high school who answers the question in exactly the way that it's intended to be answered, is taking it extremely literally. And so this person is commenting here, you do not want, it's not going to be a good essay topic if you talk about another family, a loved one who's faced a challenge. You're talking about somebody else who's not the applicant. That's always a significant mistake. Unless that motivated you in some very particular way, that's going to be relevant to your admissions look. So I discussed an applicant on an earlier episode where she did have some family tragedy, but then that motivated her very particular niche hook and focus of studying post-traumatic stress disorder in females, because some of the females in her family had been affected by post-traumatic stress disorder. And females are an understudied group in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder historically is mostly focused on, war veterans and more often a little bit more skewed towards male populations. And they tested a lot of the drugs on more male, dominant populations. And so that was her hook, which was a very, very compelling, unique niche angle. And she happened to have a personal motivation for studying that topic, but she still brought it back to her academic hook. So that's a very special case. Generally speaking, students should not, and I covered this in the last episode as well, when the student had some family adversity in their discovery questions, they were talking about their father, at the funeral. And as emotional as that could be, it could have been very significant to you. It's just not going to typically be a very compelling essay topic, you talking about a family member who's not applying for this college. So I really disagree with the student coming up with a possible response such as, a loved one who's faced any challenges that have shaped the applicants. It's a little bit odd. Again, there might be a situation, as I mentioned, whereby some sort of peripheral adversity or family struggle did end up being quite relevant to the student's academic focus, but that's a very niche and unlikely case. They put, it can be as common as your parents divorcing. Please do not talk about that as a topic in your college essays. A family member's health challenge. Please also do not, again, I gave a very particular exception where that could come into play, but that's very, very niche. You're going really off the grid. You're talking about somebody who's not applying to the college. This is a very significant mistake for many applicants who write about their grandmother in their Common App personal essay. Please understand that, generally speaking, you should not be talking about other people. You are the applicant. You're applying to the college. They want to hear about you. And they want to primarily understand what your academically relevant focus is in terms of what that very particular role is that you're going to serve in the freshman class and what you're going to study at the college. And so I would not discuss a family member's health challenge. We had a student several years ago who was interested in psychology, and she happened to have a sibling who had, a developmental disorder. And the parents wanted her to sort of discuss that, and that was her motivation. And we said that's not going to be. It's a very common topic for students to either discuss their own mental health or to discuss, the mental health of a relative as motivating their psychological interest. And that is, again, there's maybe some very niche circumstance where that could be pulled off, but in her case, it really was not going to create the most compelling information. And we really wanted to signal a lot of her very personal and unique intellectual vitality, and not just sort of run up against what a lot of other students do, which is they come up with just what is a very common essay, which is the students talking about their mental health challenges, and that's why they're interested in psychology. This is very often frowned upon, particularly at a graduate level, for applicants who apply to clinical psychology programs that are extremely competitive. It is really looked down upon if your motivation for, being a clinical psychologist is, you're mentioning in your personal statement, your statement of purpose, your own mental health struggles. It's running up against a lot of fault lines. It can come across as unprofessional, too much information, as a lot of students will say. Like, it's just really, for many students, is a place that you should ideally not go. And even more so if it's somebody else in your family, you start to really risk. You maybe avoid a bit of discussing your own mental health and some of the landmines there by discussing someone else. However, introduce some other general issues and general traps a lot of students fall into, which is it becomes too irrelevant to contextualizing your own credentials and your own candidacy because you're talking about a family member, not you. So generally speaking, there are, of course, always going to be exceptions, but I would not take this person's advice in the comments section and talk about a family member's health challenge or a parent's divorce, or something you've learned through helping a friend who has struggling. It's bumping up against a lot of landmines and potentially cliche topics. In terms of if the student were involved in a disability or neurodiversity club, that would be a little different. So if the student had a bit of, mental health, I think, is a little bit of a touchier subject to discuss in some of the essays, and it's a bit of a landmine topic. It's very hard to pull it off and execute it in the right way. A lot of students sometimes it can sound like they're trying to make excuses. Some students will talk about, how that brought down their grades, and they're using that in their personal essay. It's just really not the appropriate space to be putting that information and taking up precious real estate by harping on negatives, such as you had some lower grades. So I really don't, I think this is just, has a lot of issues. But if a student, and I would really prefer this more for something that's maybe not as charged of a topic as mental health is, and particularly the student's mental health, but it's something a little bit less touchy. Like, we had a student who had, food allergies, and they did science research on food allergies with somebody in a top Ivy League school. They, started an organization that was it was a baking organization. So the student took their love of baking and made it allergen-free, and they started this organization. That's really cool and really unique. They have a personal connection. So I know it's not fake in all likelihood, because it's sort of handicapped, or there's an honest signal there if the student did have some genuine issue, which did provide the impetus for them doing the science research, which is very academic. I like that academic side, but then they also sort of had this activism side of it as well. So they were hitting it from multiple angles, and they had a personal connection. And it wasn't as charged as a mental health subject. And then also gets into a whole bunch of other landmines and professionalism and issues, or, students trying to use that to explain away, some lower grades, for example, in their essays. So that to me was actually very compelling. And that's what the student did write, their personal essay on. It was that personal impetus for their academic hook, right? And so they were interested in the science aspect in particular, but they had shown the personal motivation. They had shown, the continuity here from their past of the science focus, the more academic intellectual side, then some of the activism, and it all came together in a very nice and neat and extremely compelling way. However, again, mental health, I think, is a little bit more of a tricky subject to manage. And, again, if they had built their academic hook or their narrative or their, on disabilities or neurodiversity, I think that would be a little bit of a different situation. It doesn't mean that we would necessarily go down that avenue, but that would be better than the student who just had an ADHD diagnosis and was just talking about it for this question. That would at least be one level up from there. I still think it's a touchy and potentially difficult to navigate topic. But of course, of the students, we mentioned this in the last episode, with sort of political or religious or some of those touchy themes, if a student had built their whole candidacy around a particularly, a particular political issue or movement, etc., yes, it's a bit risky, but what are you going to do? Their whole resume and profile and hook is built around it. So it's like you kind of really can't run away from it 100%. So if it were the case that the student had this personal, diagnosis, and then that provided the impetus, and their whole, admissions narrative and hook and their whole resume, was built around disability and neurodiversity, well, then they probably wouldn't really be able to run from it regardless, and that would essentially be their academic narrative and their admissions hook for the application. So that would be a bit of a different story. Ideally, again, because of some of the issues with the charge and just some of the landmines, it probably wouldn't be the best thing in the world to potentially build your entire college narrative around. However, if a student were really passionate about that and it was very legitimate and genuine, then I think that of course is fine. And then you just have to be very careful in the essays. Like there are just certain situations where you say, okay, we're gonna write about this. We have to write about it in a very delicate, careful, it's sort of like a red alert. Like there are some topics where you're like, I don't love this topic, but like, we'll pull it off if the kid has a lot of help and support and expertise that you could sort of say, this isn't something I would trust you to pull off by yourself, but, we feel like we can maybe navigate a bunch of the landmines here. So in terms of this student, I think a lot of the issue in terms of what the student is thinking about for a response, also what that commenter is thinking about in terms of response, it's too straight line and too just trying to come up with a very typical, adversity answer or personal growth answer or diversity answer because it mentions identity, culture, and background. And I mentioned this in our last episode with, because this is very similar to the community question that gets asked a lot, which is, identity, culture, background. It is a thinly veiled attempt for many of the colleges to get at what the student's background is in terms of if they're adding any diversity to the incoming freshman class. Now that affirmative action has been banned, and now they can't just take a checkbox, that a student is this race or this ethnicity and give them an advantage purely by virtue of checking a box. However, they can give them an advantage if they signal that they have a diverse background and can sort of more holistically discuss why that would be meaningful to the college in terms of what that would add to the college community. That is okay to afford the student a particular advantage in the admissions process in that more holistic way. And so that's why these colleges have a lot more of these types of questions where they ask students, they poke and prod at their identity, their culture, and their background. It's basically an attempt to get at, in some cases, the racial or ethnic identity via a loophole. So as we discussed in our last episode, that community question, that's very common. We discussed it particularly in the context of the University of Michigan, which outlawed affirmative action nearly 2 decades ago. And so they've long since had a community question at the University of Michigan. It's only more recently that a lot of colleges have adopted this, particularly post-affirmative action. But when we were discussing it in the last episode, I really encouraged a lot of students to think outside the box when they were describing a community, not just thinking, oh, let me just give my geographic community, let me give my religious community, let me give my, it's a very hard question if you don't come from a traditionally understood diversity background. If you are a Caucasian applicant, as the student was in the last episode, if you are an Asian, East Asian or South Asian Indian American applicant, you are, particularly in the 2 latter cases, you're an overrepresented minority, particularly at most of the selective colleges. And you just don't have a traditional diversity background that would potentially be helpful to signal to this question. You don't have a very compelling straight line response. You have to think, particularly in those situations, a lot more outside the box. Even so, it's just good to get more into this mindset of, and I understand a lot of students, this is why a lot of students really come up short in the application process, because it's a very different type of process compared to what they're accustomed to from high school. In high school, if you break the rules or you don't follow the instructions, you can get significantly penalized or punished for that, right? In the college admissions process, do they want you totally going off the grid and totally blatantly not follow the instructions at all? No, but it is also a calculated risk and a potential strategic maneuver to not just come up with the most straight line, direct, obvious, expected, cliche, very common answer that a lot of other students are going to be putting down because they're just trying to answer the question like you are. And so I refer to this as a stimulus response versus strategic response. Stimulus response is basically a knee-jerk reaction. And this is what most students are very accustomed to. It's like, I give you a stimulus. The stimulus is the prompt. And you just respond to it, basically. You just try to answer the question, right? You try to be your most diligent student that you can possibly be, and just trying to answer the question, right? You're like a legal beagle of the application process. Strategic response is you're thinking about it in less of a knee-jerk response, right? So the way that I sort of envision this is, it's a doctor and they're sort of testing your patellar reflex. And so, the little instrument they use is basically like an essay question. And, the patellar reflex is basically the student just comes up with the straight line, typical answer. Oh, identity, culture, background, or personal growth. Let me just think of, parents' divorce, family members' health challenge. Let me just think of the most typical and what's going to be a very common answer that many other students are coming up with for the sake of doing what? Just answering the question. That's not going to differentiate you. You just answering the question, trust me, the kids who are applying to Vanderbilt they can follow instructions. Like, that's not rocket science. What is a lot more difficult is to think a little bit more outside the box, a little more cleverly, and say my response is going to be within the boundaries, the allowable boundaries of the question, but I'm not going to just come up with the most typical cliche response that all these other students are coming up with ADHD, parents' divorce, family members' health challenge, something that's just very common. I can tell you all of these topics are extremely well represented in the applicant pool. Many, many, many students talk about these topics. Again, because they're trying to answer the instructions. And answering the instructions is not differentiating you. It's just not. I say to parents, families, students all the time, they'll sort of say, oh, like you're kind of straying from, the prompt a little bit. Yes, it's strategic. It's a calculated risk. If this were just about being the person who scored the highest on following the instructions, you wouldn't need an expert to help you. Anybody can follow the instructions, right? It's not that difficult. So I kind of dichotomize between the stimulus response mindset that is really ingrained in a lot of students, particularly from high school, and this strategic response mindset, which is I'm not going to be absolutely beholden to the wording of the question. I'm going to be, of course, mindful and considerate of the instructions here. And I'm not going to end up pissing off the admissions officer because I totally went so obviously and far off the reservation that becomes a major liability. But within the allowable bounds of the question and a bit of flexibility, and this is where in some cases you need to sort of include a word that will bring it back to the instructions in some way, particularly if you're going a little bit more off the reservation. Within those allowable boundaries of the instructions, I'm going to come up with the most strategic answer. So I'm going to come up with the answer that ties back to my admissions hook, right? And so I discussed in the last episode, the answer to a community question should ideally still relate to the student's academic hook. And I mentioned a student who, they could have come up with a religious background. They could have come up with their ethnic background. The student was an Indian American male applying for engineering. Do you think he has a very compelling answer to the community question? No, he's an overrepresented in multiple ways. He's extremely overrepresented minority at the top colleges, being an Indian American student, Indian American, Asian American student, vastly overrepresented minority at highly selective colleges. That's not helping his application at all. And then second, he's a male applying for engineering, and he's also vastly overrepresented in terms of engineering. So for him to come up with, I'm, an Indian American male or something about his racial ethnic background is a totally strategically disadvantaging answer to the community question. So he could not come up with a straight line answer to that question. He had to come up with a much more interesting way. And so we talked about he was part of a community of problem solvers, and we brought in a little bit of the robotics club, and sort of when they would disagree, he was part of this club and they would disagree about, buying parts. Should they buy the parts already pre-assembled, or should they build the parts, from scratch? And he would talk about all these different disagreements that would pop up and how he found a mechanism for resolving those disputes by coming up with a pros and cons list. And he made it very objective. This is also signaling very high EQ, emotional intelligence. Collaboration is so important in terms of engineering and STEM and working on projects.
MIT rates personal skills as one of the most important facets if you look at the common data set. And it's because if you are particularly in a discipline that is extremely collaborative and requires other people, your personal skills and your intangibles matter a lot, right? And so it did have some of that EQ that we discussed a lot for the student in the last episode that was being implicitly signaled by the student being able to manage disputes in the context of the club. Not just, again, we didn't want him to fall into very, traditional cliches about, just another Indian American male robotics club, like not super unique. This is where he also had some very niche, interesting interests, for example, in Formula One racing and going to Italy. That's not going to be super common among an Indian American male engineering applicant. They don't typically talk about Formula One racing, and going to Italy and following these teams is just not very common. So we came up with this community of problem solvers, and he talked about coming with this pros and cons list, and we talked about how he was a science communicator, and he was spreading engineering and STEM concepts and working with young children and doing these demonstrations with them, these science demonstrations, and teaching them physics concepts. And he was talking about all the difficulty of working with young children and how they get frustrated very easily and they cry and they scream. And we pulled those experiences together into this notion of him being part of a community of problem solvers. And it had a very clever line, about when the world's chaotic, we sort of step in and, can figure out the problem. Obviously, it's related a bit to the engineering hook. And we pulled in content that brought back to the engineering hook. But we were careful with the content that we chose, what the themes were, what they signaled about the student, make sure they didn't fall into any particular cliches. And we certainly did not come up with a straight line answer of, his Indian American background that was extremely overrepresented in the, in terms of the racial ethnic composition of the freshman class, and then particularly in engineering. Because a lot of Indian Asian students, and again, particularly males, are very, very overrepresented in a small subset of fields, particularly STEM, engineering, and related fields, particularly pre-professional fields. So if a student, if he were just going to answer the question by the letter of the law and the instructions, he would have volunteered very strategically disadvantaging very strategically disadvantaging information that would have brought down his application. So that is the trade-off. You can be the best at answering the instructions if you want to, and you can come up with a knee-jerk response, right? The doctor taps your knee, the college gives you the prompts, and all you do is you just knee-jerk react to be the student who's the best at answering the instructions. If you take that approach, you're going to end up volunteering a lot of very poor content and very strategically disadvantaging content. And that is the trap that the student is already falling into, and even the people who are commenting are also falling into. So this question is extremely broad. If she is, quote unquote, her words, not mine, a blonde, middle-class white girl who does cheerleading, she doesn't necessarily, her racial ethnic background clearly, and she obviously acknowledges this, is not going to be a differentiated answer. And given that Vanderbilt, like a lot of these other colleges, came up with this question after affirmative action and is meant to capture students, a lot of students who are from more traditionally diverse backgrounds, she knows she doesn't have a straight line answer in terms of, identity or culture or racial ethnic background. So she at least understands that part. However, this question is so broad and the boundaries are so wide for this question. It says an aspect of your identity, culture, or background. Identity is so broad. Culture might be a little bit more constrained, but even that's very broad. So it's basically any aspect of your identity, culture, or background. Background's also extremely broad. So you have, a tremendous amount of latitude here for this question. She and even the person responding here are really unnecessarily constricting the latitude and the possible, the very high degree of answers, the high degree of variance in terms of answers that you could come up, you can come up with for this question. And it's just not necessary. Like, it's an aspect of your identity background so broad, has played a role in your personal growth. Well, anything could be growth. It doesn't even have to necessarily be adversity. You could have an academic passion. This, again, perfectly taps into the admissions hook. What's an academic passion? That's still personal growth. It doesn't have to be adversity. So they're also imposing very rigid frames on this question. And part of that, too, is because they're making too much out of some certain words or some certain keywords in the question. It's also because a lot of students are so conditioned to come up with certain responses. So because students have been conditioned and their parents have been conditioned for decades to hit the community service angle, that's why so many people come up with community service answers in these questions, because they've been conditioned that there are certain answers or certain themes that you hit in your college applications, right? Adversity, community service, quote unquote, well-roundedness. And because this has been beaten into the collective consciousness of so many students and so many families, and they're so beholden, I call it availability bias. It's being what's in front of you, what are you constantly exposed to, but then that ends up creating a lot of clustering and similarity in terms of responses and students' profiles unwittingly, because everybody is exposed to the same information, and so they end up doing a lot of the same things or hitting the same themes. So that, I think, is also really constricting the response here, and viewing it from a much more strategic mindset, because they're thinking too much inside the box of very common themes that have been culturally sort of conditioned here of adversity. And personal growth doesn't necessarily mean adversity. Personal growth could just be the growth of your passion. It could be positive. It doesn't have to be adversity. And just because this is identity, culture, and background, that doesn't mean that you have to talk about, your racial or ethnic identity. And she knows she shouldn't be talking about it because it's not the traditionally understood type of diversity that the colleges are potentially getting at here. So she basically has unlimited strategic latitude. Maybe it's not unlimited, but it's a lot. It's a lot of strategic latitude. And the students should be taking more of that strategic response mindset of what is my academic hook, what's my particular unique passion and focus that I'll bring to the college. And that really should primarily be setting the tone for the answer to this question. So that is what I refer to as stimulus response versus strategic response. It's coming with a knee-jerk, instructions following answer versus coming up with an ideal answer. This is also why, and I covered this in the last episode, this is why it's so important to have a plan and an overall strategy and to understand the big picture of what you're doing before you get to the application. Because if you don't have a plan, if you don't have an overall strategy, you're just a feather in the wind. You're just a feather in the wind floating from essay prompt to essay prompt to essay prompt. So you're just going to fall into that knee-jerk response. You get to a question, and all of a sudden you're confronted with this question, you're going to try to come up with an answer, and you're going to try to follow the instructions. Then you get to the next question, and then you're going to say, oh crap, now you come up with an answer for this question. Then there's the next question, oh crap, I need to come up with an answer to this question. And students don't think the most creatively when they're just confronted with one stimulus. And so this is why we need to take a much larger mindset. It's why we have students fill out, I've read through their responses to 30 different questions, because then we can pick the best content if we give you 30 different questions and then pick the best contents, right? And then now we'll come back to some of these questions, but because we created such a larger inventory of content, and this is also the benefit of working with students over multiple years, you develop such a huge arsenal and such a huge content bank of possible responses to these questions that really you're looking at your content bank and all of these dozens of experiences, and you're looking at a huge amount of information. This is what I say in terms of, you have this whole background, but that's like all the unedited movie footage of hours and hours and hours, and the application is a film trailer. So you need to pull the best scenes and the absolute best, catchiest, most compelling, most relevant thematic content for that movie trailer. That's the application. But if you have the luxury of looking at 20 hours of film footage, you have a lot of scenes to borrow from. So you have so much abundance that you could really pick the best scenes, right? And if you're just like, oh, I have to come up with a movie trailer and come up with an amazing scene, from scratch, it's very daunting, it's very difficult, and it makes you very susceptible to coming up with a poor answer. So this is why it's very important to go into the application process with a strategic plan, an understanding of what you represent, what your most compelling angle is. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, or you need a refresher, right? We very often need to be reminded more than we need to be taught. Go back to some of the earlier episodes, right? Where I talk about the most important thing to do if you're a junior, what colleges they're looking for. And even the last episode of sort of really auditing what this hook is going to be, what this focus is going to be, what this application trailer is going to be. So, but you are very susceptible to falling into these traps, these knee-jerk, very uncompelling responses, unless you have an overall strategic architecture, a strategic plan, and a much larger inventory of possible responses to these questions where you can really pick the best possible experiences or responses to these questions versus just falling into the trap ad hoc of right here, now confronted with this answer, and you just come up with a very common cliche answer. So that is my answer for this question. She has basically nearly unlimited strategic latitude to come up with almost any answer for this question. Don't constrict yourself to just the very common cliche categories of responses of adversity and some very commonly understood background or identity, particularly one that's not going to be underrepresented in the applicant pool. The other part that I will say about this question is it does ask you on the back end, how will it contribute to our campus community as you dare to grow at Vanderbilt? You do need to then motivate the particular specifics at Vanderbilt. So if you have some particular, hook, and you have to show how you're going to flesh that hook out in terms of this is more community oriented and less academic. So this isn't as much inside the classroom. Possibly if there's some amazingly calibrated class to your academic hook, you could mention it. And for people who don't know what I'm talking about, I really fleshed this out in the last episode when we were going through the WashU supplements for the students. But really talking about, I want to be part of this program or this extracurricular, or I'll start the sports management club if they don't have that at the college, because that was his hook. It was a sports leadership angle. So his hook was the sports leadership, sports management, sports business. And so you want to show how you'd bring that to the community. So we talked about researchers who study, topics at the intersection of sports and business, sports management, ticket sales. If we change, the color on the ticket, it will sell more. If we build the stadium in this way, it will increase revenue. If we have a huge screen, very interesting intersections between business and sports. And so there were researchers at WashU who study those topics. There also were leadership initiatives. We talked about a president of baseball operations who was on one of the leadership boards at WashU, and how the student could talk about that because it was also his favorite baseball team, and how he could talk about this leadership initiative and even that person sort of, at the intersection of sports and leadership and being a sports executive. So you will also have to flesh out whatever this aspect is. You will then have to connect it to how you'll manifest it in Vanderbilt's community, more so outside the classroom because they're mentioning community versus it's less of a why major, more academically oriented or more inside the classroom prompt. So it'll be a little bit more in terms of researchers that you would potentially work with, sort of clubs or extracurriculars that you would get involved with, and how you would show a continuous narrative of what you've done in the past to what you would do in the future. And again, going back to one of the students that I mentioned for one of the student who had that supplementary recommender was an English teacher. She had founded the club that teacher was an advisor for. She had founded the first high school chapter in New York State, and that club is it's predominantly a college club, but many of the schools to which she was applying did not have that club on their campus. And so she could say, I will take this club and this chapter that I founded at my high school, the first one in New York State, very relevant to her hook, and she'll say, this college doesn't have it on their campus yet. Many other colleges do. And I'm going to come and I'm going to found the first chapter at this college. That's very valuable. It's very unique. And it allows me as a admissions officer to specifically understand what you're going to contribute to my college's community. So that's a very good example in terms of how she would take her background or an aspect, related to her hook and then bring it to the campus community at a school such as Vanderbilt. All right, number 5, last question here. So this one is a bit of a joke. So every Wednesday, the students come up with just sort of these whimsical, funny responses. So I figured this would be a fun one to pull, to inject a bit of levity into an otherwise very stressful time of year, as we're in the fall in the thick of the application process for many seniors. So we will indulge this farce a little bit, somewhat for entertainment purposes and somewhat for instructional purposes as well. So the student says, my father went to the Michigan Institute of Technology. Are there any legal repercussions to shortening it to MIT on my applications? So, okay. So this would be a very bad approach for a lot of reasons. Not least of all that you are, the student starting to get into some issues such as, falsifying information in their application, which of course, we would strongly discourage students from doing. But it does have a lot of strategically suboptimal aspects here. So first off, a matter of sort of semantics or facts, the Michigan Institute of Technology, their abbreviation is actually not MIT, it's MIIT. And so they are probably very well aware that the intellectual property lawyers at MIT are probably quite good, given that MIT churns out per capita basically more patents than any other institution in the United States. Not the most in gross. That distinction goes to the University of California, but the University of California also has a tremendous number of campuses. So per capita, taking into account that MIT is a much smaller institution, per capita, it generates the greatest number of patents per year. So I think that the Michigan Institute of Technology would want to run up against any legal landmines there. So their abbreviation is MIIT. This is not a 4-year college or university. This is more of a trade school for people interested in automotive repair. So this is more of a trade school, not traditionally understood college or university. If the student did put something like MIT, that would be an issue for several reasons. First of all, there's no particular upside. So MIT does not consider legacy status. And so this is an evolving trend in college admissions, particularly post-affirmative action. There's been a greater number of states and institutions that have been removing their legacy practices or giving preferential treatment to the children or grandchildren or other relatives of, past alum or donors. And so MIT has for quite some time now rid themselves of legacy consideration in the admissions process. I would say engineers tend to be a bit more meritocratic than maybe a lot of other subgroups. The bridges and the skyscrapers don't particularly care where your parents went to college. They just need to work and not collapse. So MIT does not consider legacy status. So if the student were interested potentially in MIT, saying that your dad went to MIT doesn't really confer any special advantage, right? However, and we've discussed this on some former podcasts, and we discussed this particularly in the context of summer programs. So when you do a pre-college summer program, it often has a university's name attached to it in many cases. Not in all cases, but particularly the pre-college summer programs do. They're attached to a particular university. And one of the possible drawbacks of that is it tips to other colleges on your list, since you're likely not applying to just that one college. If you are even applying to that college. Many students are particularly interested in that college, so that's why they do their summer program. And I think it's going to really help their prospects. And it does show that college, some extra demonstrated interest if you did their pre-college summer program. However, the issue is what it signals to all the other colleges on your list, right? It could potentially be a negative yield signal, something that could hurt the school's yield, meaning you're not as interested in attending their institution, and so you're less likely to accept an offer of admission if they extend you one. So that's what we refer to as a negative yield signal. And so the student doesn't have any upside at MIT because they don't consider legacy status. But at all the other institutions that the student would be applying to, they could see the parent's background and say, oh, maybe the student, particularly if they had strong STEM interest or engineering interest or engineering adjacent interest, they could say, oh, maybe MIT is the student's, top choice because their dad went there and therefore they have a closer relationship to MIT. That's one of the other benefits that legacy serves, and people don't focus, and the media don't focus on as much, is legacy is a positive yield signal. So if you have a closer relationship to a particular university because your parents attended, or you're more likely to have a closer relationship to that university because a parent or a grandparent or other relative attended that institution, it means you're just more likely to enroll, or you're more likely to accept an offer of admission. So legacy is a positive yield signal. A lot of people focus on the donations and, sort of this I think very sensationalized version of, as if the elites are sort of handing down the educational prestige from generation to generation to generation. That's really what the media and the states and a lot play up about legacy, but they don't take into account there's a very Not that donations and large gifts to universities aren't practical. They certainly are beneficial to the university. They create better resources, better opportunities. In some cases, they do subsidize opportunities for students who come from more marginalized or underrepresented backgrounds. But there's also a very practical element of legacy also provides a very positive yield signal and shows closer connection to an institution, which means you're more likely to accept their offer of admission. And because the yield is so critical to these institutions, because enrollment management is so critical to all of these institutions, even the top colleges, even the best colleges still lose 15% of their applicants, right? Harvard and Stanford still lose 15%. 20% of their applicants to other colleges, right? And there are many schools, top 10, top 15, top 20, that lose 40% of their students in terms of those they extend offers to other institutions where they enroll instead. So yield is extremely important, and legacy does provide a very positive, yield signal. So if the student did, if we sort of entertain this quite a bit and indulge it, in putting MIT, again, particularly if the student had interests that particularly tracked to wanting to go to MIT, they would not be getting any upside at MIT, but they'd be getting all the potential downsides of sending a negative yield signal to alternative institutions, right? And at some level, you can't run away from this. Your parents went to wherever they went, but the student is talking about it as a strategic maneuver, and so we're pointing out the significant strategic liabilities of this possible maneuver, and it is something to generally consider. It could be a little bit more difficult, particularly if you have two parents who went to the same institution, you have double legacy, but it is something they are looking at a lot of these very small signals in terms of the yield, right? So a lot of these schools do look at the campus visits, they look at the information session attendance, they of course want to look at those essays and see, do you really know the school extremely well at an extraordinary level of nuance? Or does it seem like you don't know the school very well and you're not very well connected to it? So they are looking at a lot of these signs, email open rates. Did you click the links? Did you, they're just looking at all this because you can take all these variables, combine them into a model and get a pretty good prediction as to what, whether the student's likely to enroll or not. So that would be what I would basically refer to as, and what I've referred to on the podcast as, a dominated strategy. There'd be no upside at MIT, but there'd be downsides potentially at the alternative institutions. So it's a strategy that has no reward, but has only risk. And so it would be a very poor strategy. Some of the other issues, so this Michigan Institute of Technology is not traditionally understood as a college or university. So this is more of a trade school. By that definition and by that classification, the student would still potentially qualify as a first generation student. Of course, it would depend what their mother's educational status were. But if their mother didn't attend a traditional 4-year, university, it's typically 4 years, and you're getting a bachelor's degree. So if you went to a junior college, or you didn't finish college, or got an associate's degree, or even registered nurse, that's a 2-year degree. It's not a 4-year degree. It's not a bachelor's. It's not a bachelor's of science in nursing, for example. That is what defines first generation status. So first generation status is most traditionally defined as neither of your two parents attended, and also they received a degree from a 4-year institution, typically a 4-year degree. Now, there are some international institutions that give 3-year degrees, and they're still basically, equal to a 4-year bachelor's degree, at a U.S. institution. So that still will not qualify you for first generation status. However, at least on the student's dad's side, if they went to this MIIT instead of the MIT in Massachusetts, the one that's more well known, they would still potentially qualify as a first generation student depending on what their mother's educational status were. And the importance of this, or the import of this, is a lot of people don't know this, but about 15 to 20% of every incoming freshman class at the top colleges is going to consist of first generation college students. So the student would also be potentially removing a very substantial institutional priority for many of the top colleges. It is something they really, really pride themselves on, is taking first-generation students, because these top colleges particularly, view this as a responsibility, a social obligation to expand educational access and opportunity. And, by accepting first-generation students, it allows, that student's family for the first time, to basically have had access to a, traditionally understood, traditionally defined college experience, and to expand that sort of educational opportunity and access. Also for first generation students, it is, their parents didn't go to these types of colleges. So they're maybe perceived as less equipped to help the student with the application process. I think a lot of people, regardless of your educational background, even if you went to the best colleges, you still understand how difficult and complex and nuanced this application process is and how daunting it is. Even if you did go to a more traditional college or university, even a top and extremely selective one. But you can imagine for a student who, both of whose parents did not go that route, they never had an application process, they're potentially a lot less well equipped to help the student through that journey, and don't have the resources in a lot of cases to afford other means. So that's also part of the equation of why they prioritize a lot of these students. And in terms of sort of conveying, I discussed this in the application red flags episode, I think a lot of students fall into this trap. It's quite endearing that a lot of students, there's a lot of students that are very proud of their parents' educations and their parents' backgrounds, which I think is awesome, right? They're like, my dad went to Harvard, my mom's this, they worked their way up to this career, and they're very proud of their title, their status, their educational background. However, it doesn't necessarily create the greatest rooting interest for the application, and for some of the reasons that I just mentioned, and that I brought up in the application red flags episode, where I talked about if the parent has a career background that is very related to the student's academic interest in college or their resume, that could be perceived a bit as maybe the parents sort of push them towards that field. Maybe they're not genuinely as passionate about it themselves. Maybe some of their quote-unquote internships or opportunities came from their parents' networking opportunities. There's a bit of an unfair advantage there. And so there are a lot of these, social signals that are potentially being conveyed. And since generally, if we are taking the movie analogy that I used a lot in the last episode, and I used a bit in this episode, if we're taking the movie analogy, and this application is essentially a movie trailer, it's representative of a larger movie, you do want to tend to signal yourself a little bit more as the underdog than, as the student, where you could sort of see a straight line. They came from privilege, parents went to the best institutions, occupy very prestigious, traditionally highly regarded, elevated careers, particularly if they're related to the student's interests as well. That could connote additional advantage. And the student's just sort of continuing in maybe a straight line, particularly again if they go to a private school. There's just a lot of optics here, and admissions officers are always very, very aware of students' context and the racial, ethnic, socioeconomic backgrounds, their parents' college backgrounds, particularly as related to first generation or continuing generation college status. So this student is sort of falling to this mistake of, they're saying my parent maybe came from not as traditionally understood as being, as prestigious or traditional college or university, Michigan Institute of Technology versus MIT. If I make my parents, seem more like they went to one of these prestigious colleges, that will help me. And it's actually quite a bit of the reverse. It's actually would be better to not signal that and to make it seem like the student had much more of an underdog story and didn't have a lot of the advantages that would potentially be conferred by a student, by a parent, or a background where the parent went to MIT and therefore went through a very similar type of application process, clearly very well educated at a top and extremely prestigious institution, particularly if the student had engineering or STEM interests. You can clearly see a straight line and a connection there. And so they're sort of doing the opposite. And this is a lot of students do this. They're very proud of their parents' careers, their occupations, their educational upbringings. But it's sort of the opposite of what would actually create the most substantial rooting interest for the application, because humans are also very hardwired, particularly admissions officers. Admissions officers tend to come from very modest career paths. They're on very modest salaries. And, nobody's going to accuse an admissions officer, somebody who goes to work in a college admissions office, of trying to pull off a get rich, quick scheme. So you do have to understand all those optics, the perception, particularly, and the way that admissions officers are going to be viewing these applications and the current college admissions landscape. And, a lot of these just, social, cultural, racial, ethnic, socioeconomic factors. But you do have to understand, even at a much deeper human level, we tend not to watch movies with people, like we love to root for the underdog, right? And so I would actually say the student is going in the opposite direction here, switching their dad to having gone to MIT. Now, again, the benefit would be if that's going to help them in terms of legacy status. So that's one of the asterisks, of course. If it were going to help their application, particularly if that were one of their top schools, then that legacy status could be potentially quite useful to the students. However, as I covered again, this is not the case at MIT, unfortunately. So it would be a strategy with essentially no upside, but a very significant number of downsides, as I have expounded. So, of course, this was a humorous post, but I thought we would indulge a bit of the humor as well as the actual strategic instructional aspects as well. Okay, that is it for this episode. Again, if anybody has a question they want to send along, we'll include a link in the show notes, and we will potentially cover it on a future episode. And that is it for today. Hopefully this was helpful to everyone, and we will talk soon in the next episode. Bye-bye.